Hi, my name is Will, and this is Ulexia Tutoring. And today I was walking through the dollar store and I found a bunch of educational materials that I wanted to talk about today in order to explain sight words, what they are, what they aren't, and the two definitions we go by. And one thing about the confusion because of these two very different definitions, one being kind of just a technical description of what goes on in the brain when kids are reading fluently, and the other being sight words, as in these are words that kids need to know first and they should learn them as quick as possible, and they should do that through any means necessary. All right. And so the idea is that if you look at sight words, these words that are very regular, very commonly used, but also spelled irregularly usually, that if you just look at them and watch flashcards and have them exposure over and over and over again, you memorize what the words look like and you're able to use them. Okay, and this goes against the science of what actually goes on with fluent reading. When kids read fluently, it tends to be that they don't actually have to decode words anymore, that words have been orthographically mapped within their minds, which means they see them and they can't help but reading them, and it happens immediately. Now, I want to just demonstrate how that works. But the idea that words are visually memorized is not true, and I want to show you, or that it's not the primary means of fluent reading, that maybe some words can be visualized, but our visual cortex isn't actually as strong as the process that leads to orthographically mapped words that we recognize immediately on sight and are able to read. And so I have a little presentation here about how words are not visually memorized. And here, these are all sight words for somebody who's a fluent reader. Words are not visually memorized. And if words were visually memorized, we shouldn't actually be able to read this because I'm using a font which is called Georgia, which isn't used very often, and it's slightly different than, say, Times Roman or Arial. So if they're visually memorized, you wouldn't be able to recognize this by this font. And even more so, if I change the font entirely and all the fonts and change the capitalization, we actually still read this in the same way. Words are not visually memorized. Even though this is crazy font with crazy capitalizations and everything else, these words are still part of our sight word lexicon, part of our orthographic lexicon. The words have been orthographically mapped into our minds. And so I want to talk about what sight words are, why some homeschool parents are absolutely frightened of them. And I have a very good friend who we found out we were both homeschooling parents, and he said, "You don't teach sight words, do you?" And at this point, I said, "No, never. Of course not." And I think that if that's as much as you know, that's a good start. If you're afraid of sight words, we don't need to go any further. But in order to know actually how to help your kid reach total fluency, it helps to know what the technical meaning of sight words is. And again, I don't like that term. We could just use orthographically mapped words, but nobody likes to say that very much because it's a mouthful. So let's go first and look at the destructive teaching method, which is sight words. All right, so this is something I saw on Etsy, a bestseller, 104 baby first word flashcards. So you're supposed to give this to babies, I guess, or young kids who are pre-literate, and you give them these flashcards, and they have pictures on them, and then they have words underneath. Now, if a kid doesn't have the alphabetic, the correspondence between symbol and sound, for example, that the letter A says ah, all right, or the letter K says k, if you haven't developed automatic recognition of the sound symbol correspondence, then, which I assume most pre-literate kids are not, then what is the point of putting the word acorn down here? If you don't know the alphabetic sounds and the principles behind them, then it's not really going to help you. Like there's this series of letters, might as well just be a picture. And that's why they have the picture above it, not so that you can figure out the sounds of ACORN, but that you can just look at the picture and know what those letters represent. So it's not by parsing the word for sounds, but by associating the image or the meaning with this picture, which just happens to be a picture comprised of letters. And they might as well be random. Doesn't matter what they are. In order to read the word acorn, you need to do some advanced phonics. You would need to know that the letter A says ah, but in open syllables it says a, and that OR says or, and that C followed by O, A, or U says k, but if it's followed by E, I, or Y says s, in order to be able to read this word acorn. So it's not appropriate at all for for beginning level readers, and certainly not for babies. Same thing goes with alligator. This is a complex multisyllabic word. Alligator, 4 syllables. Generally, you want to work on single syllable words before moving into multisyllable, and you want to make sure that they've learned all the basic phonics rules before moving on to multisyllable, where you start getting into open and closed syllables and sound of the vowel versus the name of the vowel. All right, so we get the same thing. Acorn, alligator, ball, bear. Bear, EA usually says E, but in the word bear, it says b, or you might think of another vowel as being air, but that doesn't really matter how you teach phonics in particular, just that you teach them in a correct way. But here they're not doing phonics at all. This is before phonics. You just want to sight memorize the way these words look and associate them with the meaning, right? Now, there's a funny story in Why Jenny Can't Read by Rudolf Fleisch, written in 1955. This book caused a panic, essentially, among educators and parents when they realized that kids were starting to not know how to read, which was kind of new in the 1950s. Kids up to the 1950s seemingly knew how to read, but now the levels of reading proficiency were dropping dramatically. And in that story, it talked about using flashcards, and this kid who was reading a book, and he comes across the word elephant, and he says, I don't know this word. And so the people who were teaching him were like, no, you know this word. We've seen you read it before. He's like, no, I have no idea what this word is. And so they pulled out the flashcards they were using, and they went through, and he was reading the flashcards, and he gets the word elephant, which is a word he couldn't read in the book, and immediately says elephant. And they say, oh, so the word elephant. Good. So now what's this word down here? He looks down at the book again. He's like, I have no idea. And they say, well, how do you know that this word is elephant? And he looks at it, and it just has the word elephant, just the text. But in the top right-hand corner, there was a smudge, a dark ink smudge. And he said, I know the word is elephant because there's a big smudge on the top. And you told me that the word's elephant, and I recognize the smudge. So I always know that that word's elephant. So even looking at these kind of flashcards, it's not apparent what actually the students are doing. Are they attending to the letters? And if they don't know the letters and the sound symbol correspondence, then it's unlikely that they are attending to the letters at all. And maybe they're just getting an image of what the pictures are. So it's strict visual memorization, which again doesn't work, and we'll demonstrate that more fully later. And so as I was walking through the store today, as I usually do, you will find all sorts of like little things that people want to buy because they want their kids to become good readers and they want to be successful. So I found Winnie the Pooh, Pooh's first words. Bounce is the only one we can really see here, but you can imagine swing, or I don't know, it starts with a P, so I can't tell what that word is. But it's saying these are the first words, and we're going to memorize them by sight. By showing you a picture of Tigger bouncing, we'll learn the word bounce. Not by attending to the letters, but by associating the word that's comprised of letters incidentally to the meaning of bounce. First words, this is kindergarten level. Kindergartners do not learn the word carrot or bowl or spoon usually. Maybe spoon, but bowl is irregular. OW should say ow. This word should say bowel, but it says bowl. So you can teach it, but generally in kindergarten and public schools, they don't get to advanced phonics yet, or orthographic analysis, looking at words and saying, do they play fair? Do they play by the rules of our right spelling system, or do they break the rules? All right, and carrot. Yeah, carrot does not belong. Spoon. And so you can imagine you're just going to open up this book, and it's going to give you different meaning-based activities to help you visually associate this word. It's incidentally spelled C-A-R-R-O-T, that it means carrot, that the meaning is carrot. All right. And then we have the last one, Sesame Street. Sesame Street, first words flashcards are designed with easy learning in mind. To start, hold up each card, say the word out loud, and point the object illustrated. Bright, bold letters and delightful illustrations make learning easy and fun. I mean, who doesn't want to get fun little characters for the kids to teach them how to read, to make reading fun? Unfortunately, what this will do is it will damage your kid. It will, for a lot of kids, it will have the effect of teaching them the 3 cueing system, which leads to reading disability. All right. So let's talk about how it is that we might approach sight words in an effective way. These little boxes here are called Elkonin boxes. This is my personal way of making them, so there's different ways you can find them. But for my online tutoring, this is how I generally do it. And this is just what it looks like. I'll show you later how to build these. But sight words are actually orthographic mapping. In order for a word to go into your orthographic lexicon so that you look at the word and you automatically know the word and you can't help but read it, so that you're not decoding, what happens is that you associate the sounds of the word in bread, which has 4 sounds, b, e, d, and you associate that to the actual spelling, which is bread. And in order to do this, we can talk about the sounds b, e, d, and then how it's pronounced. And then what part of this word is weird? The EA. The EA should say E because that's the phonics rule. EA says E. We expect it to say E, but in this case it says E. So we just need to remember that. And we can have the students analyze this and build these little maps and then go through and review them. Always making sure that they're attending to the letters. All right, built. Again, built has 5 letters, but only 4 sounds. B, I, O, T. And what is funny about this word? Well, the U doesn't seem to be doing anything. Or another way, what letter or letters is saying I in the word built? The UI is saying I. Fair enough. Okay. Or you could say the letter U is doing nothing and the I is saying I. Okay. One is a troublesome word. If you look at it, the spellings don't correspond very well at all. For example, what is saying the W in one? Apparently nothing. Or you could say that the O is pulling double duty and saying W and Usually the letter O says ah, but the E makes the O say its name. So this should be own, own, but instead it says one. So bring attention to the actual pronunciation versus the actual spelling. Enough. Enough, we have multi-syllable word here, 2 syllables. So the first syllable, instead of using circles, I used diamonds. Enough. Now what part is saying in enough? OU is saying What part is saying f? GH is saying f. So enough. Bring attention to the actual spelling and then review it. Wait. Here again, we have a, w, a, t. What part of the word is saying a? E-I-G-H. What part is saying w? W. What part is saying t? T. Good. So the irregular part is the E-I-G-H. And then we could also do things like play with it. So if you say wait, but don't say w, what word do you get? 8. All right, that word actually works as well. Very good. And then you can go through and again review them with your students. And if you find that there are words they don't know, always put them in Elkonin boxes. Have them review them. It tends to be with neurotypical kids who are good readers. Once they develop fluent reading habits, they only need 2 or 3 exposures to a word for it to go into their orthographic lexicon to become the technical meaning of a sight word, a word that they don't need to decode anymore. They just recognize it on sight. 2 to 3. With kids who have certain forms of dyslexia, surface level dyslexia, it might take them 15, 20, or even 30 exposures getting explicit instruction each time. All right, so it can be a real struggle for those kids, particularly if they've been learning to read incorrectly for 3 or 4 years. All right, so let's talk about sight words. Here's a little effect that we can have. The effect of orthographically mapped words. Underneath this, I'm going to have you read the word, and if it comes out immediately for you, then it's a sight word. And I imagine if you're a good reader, these words will pop out at you immediately. So you won't be able to help reading them, even if I fly through it real quick. So here we go. The first word, school. All right, we don't need to go through the word school and decode it. S, k, u, ul, or s, ch, ul, school. We don't need to do that. It just immediately comes out. And it takes about 0.7 milliseconds. It gets real quick. And if it's an orthographically mapped word. All right, let's try another one. Student. If you caught that word student, Did you notice that it was kind of written weird, but you still read it? Student with 2 capital ST, U, D, capital E, N, T. Even though it's written irregularly, you're still able to read it. And that means it's not visually memorized because you've never seen the word spelled like that with capital letters in that random way. So it goes deeper than visual memorization. It is orthographically mapped. The sounds and the letters are combined in your head to create that deeper level of recall. Teachers. All right, again, we have the weird fonts. For each of the letters, we have different fonts, and we have random capitalized letters, and the word pops out at your head. All right, let's check out the last word here. You ready? Pay attention to this one. I'm not going to say it out loud. I'll try to stop myself. What was the word? The word was educational. And if you look real close, you'll see that educational here is spelled E-U-D-C-A-T-I-O-N-A-L. And even though all the letters are jumbled up in the middle, because the E and the L are in the right place, it tends to be you can read these words. And that's called popularly the Cambridge effect. And we'll look at that in a moment here. So the Cambridge University effect is kind of an online little meme. Popularized, that's why it's called the Cambridge University, not because it was actually done at Cambridge, but because of this short sentence. According to our research at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be at the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. And that's for words that are orthographically mapped. If these words aren't orthographically mapped for you, you're not going to be able to read them even if they're spelled correctly. All right, and this incorrect spelling doesn't allow for decoding, for breaking the word into its constituent parts and then putting them back together and figuring out what the word is. Okay. Oh, so let's look at another effect. I believe this is called the Stroop Effect. But the effect of orthographically mapped words: do not read the word, just say the color. All right, and I challenge you to do this at home, but I'm going to try to do it. I've done this before, and I can never do it. All right, so I'm going to try to not read the word. I'm just going to say the color that the word is written in. I'm just saying the color. Red. Oh, I did it that time. All right. I kind of had to blur my eyes in order to do that, but generally, and you might have, if you were doing it at home, saw green. Okay. Blue. Blue jumps into my head before orange for sure. So it's like both things are coming at me at once, and I'm focusing on the color, but the word blue jumps in my mind, and I have to stop it in order to say orange. Yellow. Yellow jumps into my mind before I can even realize that this is purple. Black. Black jumps in immediately. Pink does not come in until sometime later. And that is the Stroop Effect. Sight words, words that are mapped orthographically within your mind, will pop out really quick, and you can't help but read them, even if you're trying not to read them and focusing on some other feature of the word itself. So in order to teach sight words, or in order to help your child develop orthographically mapped words that become sight words in their heads, words that they cannot help but read, sight words, one, they develop naturally. It's a natural thing that the more times you're exposed to a word, that you stop needing to be able to decode it, or you stop having to decode it. It'll just pop in your head naturally. So as they develop into strong readers, this will happen. And you can do some things to help it along. Again, some dyslexic students need 20 exposures to a single word. That'll happen. Sometimes I've had students with dyslexia that their orthographically mapped words were incorrect. And so the word was and saw for one of my students, she would see was and she'd say saw. And so I had to work with her because it's not that she was decoding or anything, but those words were just mapped incorrectly, it seemed. And so I would give her 2 sentences where both possibilities was and saw were semantically appropriate, or syntactically appropriate too. So I'd give her, Paul was a funny dog. Paul saw a funny dog. And I'd give her sentences like that, different variations, to where both could work logically within the context of the sentence, but to make sure that she was actually decoding the word, that she actually saw the word, and to bring it to her attention every time she didn't. And I do other kind of exercises to kind of break this association, this incorrect mapping. But one way to do it, always point out the spelling, how the spelling corresponds to the sounds. With irregular words, just because they don't play fair, doesn't mean we can't notice what the actual sounds are doing. In the word night, for example, what is saying I in night? Well, the IGH, N-I-G-H-T, I is spelled IGH in this word. All right. Instruction must be explicit. Don't make them guess. Give them the word. Introduce the word if they're struggling. If you give them an irregular word that's very common, like the word night, and they're looking at it and they're trying to figure it out, just tell them, say, this word is night. And then look at how it's spelled and how it corresponds to the sounds. Immediately interrupt errors and supply the correct word. Never wait to correct your student, all right? Even if it interrupts them. The most important thing is that they get the words right and they read accurately. Reading inaccurately is not what you want. You don't want them to be in the habit of saying words incorrectly. Even if you go back and correct it, you want to keep an eye on them, and every time you have a chance to correct them and bring their attention to the word, to the spelling, and to the sounds. Record misread words and incorporate them into spelling and to Elkonin boxes or into different exercises. Give them a lot of points of entry into a word. And so now we're going to go through and I'll show you how I kind of work with sight words by using the fry list. A fry list is, I think, around 1,200 words that are very common, and that if a student knows all these words by sight, essentially they'll very likely be a very fluent reader. And so what I want to know is, do my students already have these words in their orthographic lexicon? Because a lot of students, even dyslexic, have certain words that they just know and they can read automatically. And so we don't want to focus on those, but we want to identify the words that are worthwhile that they haven't mapped orthographically. So this is group 33. Each group has 12 words in my little system. And so I go through and I open it up, and the first word is course. All right, student says course, and just like I did, that's orthographically mapped. There was no delay, just read immediately, and I didn't have to decode hours, something like that. If the student was saying course, you say, oh no, the word is course, or s. So what part's saying this se? And what is the our saying? Should say our, but it's saying or, course. And then I would go through and say how many sounds are in the word course. K, or, s. 3 sounds. Interesting. There's 6 letters, but only 3 sounds. So we'll get my Elkonin box that has 3 sounds on it. I'll bring it over. And we will say, all right, what were the 3 sounds in the word course? And the student will say, the sounds were k. Oops. The sounds were k, or, s. And for the s, I might even do a double S, just to make sure that they don't see a S and say z. Although in the top part, you want to use the regular spellings. So OR, we expect to say or. Although there are instances where it doesn't, we always expect it to. So k, or, s. And I always use K whenever it's a k sound, because C, again, if it's followed by E, I, or Y, always says s. And if it's followed by O, A, or U, always says k. And then, oh, do you remember how to spell it? Yeah. Wasn't it C-O-R-S-E? Well, that's very good. That word would say course, course. But there's actually a U in it. And so what's the funny part of this word? Well, the funny part is that it has OU, which should say ow. But here, the OUR says or. And then also the E at the end is kind of funny. The E doesn't seem to be doing anything. Doesn't make any of the vowels say their names. So that's funny about it. Okay, interesting. So the SE says S. All right, and then you take this, and I would put it on a different slide where I have all my review words, but just for this demonstration, I will not. And we'll go to the next word. English. Perfect. That is orthographically mapped. That was automatic. You read that with automaticity. Stay. Perfect. Island. Island. Okay, good. Excellent job. That word is island. And so that means that this student has knowledge of the word, but hasn't developed automaticity. If they say Island, island, then it means they're still decoding and this word isn't popping into their head and they can't prevent themselves from reading it, essentially. So this would be a good word to now go through and say, how many syllables are in this word? How many beats? Let's see, clap it out. Island. There are 2 beats. Very good. Now, let's take the 2 beats and what was the first syllable? I. Good. And what was the second syllable? Land. Now, was it land or was it lind? Do you say I land or I lind? Lind, yes. Good. So we want to make sure to write it as it's actually pronounced. Just because it has L-A-N-D there doesn't mean it says land. In this word, it actually says lind. And then let's change these phoneme circles to syllabic diamonds. All right, so island. And do you remember how it's spelled? I-S-L-A-N-D. Very good. And so what part of this word is saying I? Oh, the I-S is saying I. Very good. And what part is saying the I? The A is saying I. Interesting. Good. So island. And we'll put that back into our review slide or pile or whatever. And we go through farmer. Great job. What part of farmer, what part of this word is saying the R? Oh, the AR is saying R. And what part's saying ER is saying ER. Good. So you can always review those things. Just point them out to the student, even though that word is absolutely mapped. But we don't need to work with this word any further. Yes. System. System. Very good. And what's the Y saying in system? It's saying I. Now, does that play fair? Yeah, it plays fair. Why? Well, the Y acts just like an I. And if I was to replace it with an I here, it would say sys. And so, yeah, the system. Oh, actually, the system. EM here says That's kind of unfair. Good. Good noticing. Full. Known. All right. This word is, as the teacher, he would say, this word is known. It should say known, but it says known. The OW should say ow, but it's saying O. And then the K is silent. I might also tell them that in Old English, this word actually played fair because it was pronounced known. Known. Or in Middle English, known. But since then, we've lost the K. But then you bring in the Elkonin box and put it in for review. All right, and you go through and do that with all your words. Happy, thou, thought. Okay, no, this word is though. What part's saying O? O-U-G-H. Good. And then you make an Elkonin box for every word that they struggle with or that they don't read with fluency. Even if it's a word that they eventually get, like street. Good. You're right, it is street. Now let's just make sure how many sounds are in that word. St, e, t. 5 sounds. Good. So let's put that in there. The student, even though this word play is totally fair, the student doesn't have it orthographically mapped. So we want to make sure and give them a chance to review it and to develop that orthographically mapped word in their little mind. So what's the first sound in street? S, t, e, t. And how is it spelled? Same way. Awesome. Does that word play fair? Absolutely. How do we know? Because the spelling is the same as the phonemes in a regular way. Awesome. All right. And then when I have review words, I'll also make a second pile for mastered words. When they've mastered a review word, I put it into the mastered pile so that we don't have to, so we can just review them from time to time. And it tends to be if a word's orthographically mapped, they won't forget it. But sometimes they're on the verge of orthographically mapping. So if you go over it and it's in the mastered pile, say 1 out of 15, they might make an error on. You just put it back in the review. All right. So that's what I have to say about sight words. They're not visually memorized. That's not the process of developing sight words. and orthographically mapped words. If you're afraid of the word sight words, you're absolutely right to be. The way they teach sight words and the way people understand sight words is usually incorrect. So it's important that you make sure that your child gets appropriate instruction. If you train sight words as if they're visually memorized and you do exercises to make them just see the words over and over again and memorize them by rote without any correspondence to the letters and the spelling, it will create a method of perception of these words that will cause problems. This is called a compensatory strategy, and children will try to answer without going through the process of working at reading a word, because reading is kind of hard, especially when you're beginning. The automatic recall of sounds and symbols is hard, and so if they can figure out a word through other means by like looking at a picture, don't put pictures into elementary primary school like reading. Don't do it, because kids will look at those pictures and they'll guess the words. And if your teachers are encouraging to guess words, then I would recommend doing something about it. You don't want your kids to be reading disabled because of instruction. If you're curious about that, look at my other videos, particularly about the 68% reading failure in America. That the majority of reading failure, in fact, probably all of it, is caused by instructional problems. The vast majority of reading failure is caused by poor instruction. Have a good day. It was nice to talk to you. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please put them into the comments section. I would love to hear what you have to say. Have a good day. Cheers.